Cinderella, Chronicle of a Single Shoe, a fairy tale in a light, ironic tone. The setting, a kingdom uncannily similar to France, in those graceful times when crystal slippers were taken as a serious fashion statement, confirming the old truth that beauty requires sacrifice. Prologue, in which the order of things is declared. In a kingdom where kings loved minted coins, queens loved minted phrases, and courtiers loved minted bows, there once lived a young woman named Cinderella. She was not called that because her parents dreamed of gold or a stable economic future, but because she so often looked as if she had just been taken out of the fireplace, with soot on her cheeks and a burning look in her eyes. And she knew perfectly well that firewood was far from the hardest thing in life. From childhood, Cinderella learned two unshakable rules. If you don't argue with fate, it starts arguing with boredom, and just to stay in shape, it will spoil your evening. If you do argue, keep a bucket of water and a sense of humor close by. Her father was a kind man, which sadly is not the best armor against circumstances. He married again to a lady of noble appearance, steel temperament, and practical convictions. Happiness, in her view, was when the neighbor was doing worse. This lady had two daughters, not evil by nature, merely raised with the firm belief that any kind of labor ruins the skin and that other people's efforts exist mainly to preserve their manicure in pristine purity. Her father soon departed on a long trading journey, and his letters grew shorter and shorter. Then they stopped altogether, perhaps because of the current, perhaps because of custom's duty. Chapter 1, in which work is a plan for the day and dreams are a plan for life. The house that had fallen to the stepmother loved the sound of a broom and the smell of boiling soup more than it did music. Cinderella rose when the rooster was still formulating his complaints about the world, and by noon she had already lived a small, fully furnished life, lit the fire, fed the humans and the livestock, watered the garden, wiped the cook's tears, and smiled at the laundress. The sisters, meanwhile, labored in the field of aesthetics, flipping through fashionable engravings, debating shades of ribbon, and discussing how the word immediately sounds in different dialects. Cinderella, to be fair, was no saint. She was fully aware that her use resembled labor exploitation with a minimal social package, yet she possessed a double invisible luxury, taste, and an inner catalog of marvels. She would tell herself, "Someday all this will come in handy. If not in life, then at least in my memoirs." Her best friends were mushrooms. That only sounds strange until you've tried listening to a human. Mushrooms, unlike people, don't interrupt. The nearby forest was short, like young hope, and patient, like an old gardener. There, Cinderella learned to sharpen knives, thoughts, and tone alike. Chapter 2, filled with courtly news and evening plans. The king had aged beautifully. He could walk, joke, and occasionally remember where he was going. He had a son, the heir, handsome, an amateur musician, and an occasional philosopher. The prince viewed the world as a play about to start rehearsals, and he kept looking around for a role slightly better than the one tradition had written for him. And so, one day, a decree echoed across the kingdom. A ball. The reason was simple. The prince had turned that particular age when saying "too early" sounded awkward and "too late" was premature. Royal heralds galloped through the squares, exhaling the grand phrase, "Every noble family shall attend with their daughters, the flowers of our realm." And gasping for air, they added, "and in decent footwear." Cinderella's household quivered. The stepmother unleashed her full cultural power. The sisters exclaimed like shoppers spotting a long-awaited sale item. There followed the cutting of fabrics, arguments about corsets, and a choreography of caprice. Cinderella, the laces, Cinderella, the buttons, Cinderella. Where's my patience? Patience, fortunately, was with Cinderella. She had kept it for herself. "Will you go?" asked the garden quietly. "Unlikely," said Cinderella, "but I'm good at being where I'm not. Saves time and annoys people." Chapter 3, where aesthetics meets logistics. On the day of the ball, the house resembled a theater. Actors inside and the audience outside, in the form of apple trees and the neighbor's cat. The sisters dressed in fashionable hues, dawn over the sea, and pink that doesn't suit everyone. The stepmother snapped her fan, and the procession departed. "You," she said to Cinderella, not maliciously, just as a formality, "clean up, and remember, a woman's life is divided into before the ball and after the cleaning." The door closed. The house fell silent enough for the furniture's thoughts to be heard. Cinderella walked to the kitchen, poured herself a bowl of soup, sat down, and finally allowed herself a rare luxury: silence. But silence, as we know, is never entirely free. Within it one can hear the footsteps of destiny. And destiny, let's be honest, has a very light step. "May I?" asked a voice that sounded like a violin well versed in waltzes. On the threshold stood a woman in a cloak, the color of old silver. Her face was pleasant and tailor-like, as though she knew how to fit reality to size. "Who are you?" asked Cinderella, weighing the bread knife in her hand. "Just in case." "I'm what your late godmother used to call, with a smirk, Plan B. You may call me Fairy, or Auntie, for the paperwork, good fairy. In practice, efficient fairy. And no, I don't turn random objects into carriages merely because it's pretty. I work from briefs." "Briefs?" Cinderella nearly dropped her spoon. "I have a brief." "Every dream has a brief," said the fairy, settling down. "Yours says the heroine needs one evening where she's noticed not for sweeping crumbs, but for moving as if dancing were a way of existing. So do you want to go to the ball?" Cinderella looked at the ceiling, as if the answers were written there. Sometimes they really are, in stains shaped like maps of undiscovered lands. "Yes," she said, "I do. But I have no dress, no horse, no invitation, no time, and no habit of asking for the impossible." "Perfect," the fairy smiled. "Lists of contradictions usually make the best evenings." Chapter 4, where magic is a technology with deadlines. What followed next was what textbooks for young enchantresses politely call a comprehensive intervention in events with minimal ecological impact. From the vegetable garden emerged a pumpkin asset. From mice, a team of horses with a manageable panic risk. From a rat, a coachman with a life purpose. The fairy didn't conjure the dress. She summoned it from the fabric of the world itself, the one we rarely notice. It was the color of late afternoon, when the light is still warm, but the shadows have already started whispering. That evening has things to say. "I know you were expecting crystal slippers," said the fairy, taking a box from her bag. "But crystal is for people unfamiliar with city pavements. Yours are tempered glass, light, strong, elegant. The secret is in the fit. Comfort matters more than legend. You'll dance and think about the meaning of life, not your blisters." "I love you," said Cinderella honestly. "Can I go now?" You may. But rules are rules, the fairy sighed. My power runs not only on desire, but on discipline. At midnight the spell will end. Don't be late, and remember, you owe nothing, not to the prince, not to the king, not to the gallery of glances. Your only duty is to yourself, to be who you dream of being, at least tonight. Fair enough, said Cinderella. If something goes wrong, I'll improvise. That, said the fairy, is the main skill of all heroines. She snapped her fingers. The world blinked. The pumpkin cleared its throat. The horses stopped being mice before their very eyes, and the dress fit more precisely than care itself. Chapter 5, in which the ball is a spectacle and the audience is all of us. The palace was white as intentions and cool as a marble temperament. Torches burned, musicians tried their best, and servants whisked away trays faster than the guests could realize they didn't actually want anything. Cinderella entered, not like a storm, not like lightning, not as behold the goddess. She entered like someone who has finally arrived somewhere that interests her. The prince didn't notice her immediately. He was conversing with a countess who possessed serious intentions and light gloves. Then he noticed, and couldn't quite believe it, because courtly logic rarely accommodates simple solutions. He took one step, then another, and suddenly they were close. The crowd fell silent. In palaces, such silence is expensive. May I? He asked, offering a dance. There was that mix of music and uncertainty in his eyes that makes men look human. You may, said Cinderella, smiling as those do who have spent a lifetime practicing how to dance between a broom and a duty. They danced lightly, as if the floor itself were gently pushing them upward. The prince spoke quietly, without royal turns of phrase. He asked, she answered, not everything, but enough. About music, about books read secretly, about how everyone has their own hearth, a place that both warms and smudges you at once. Where are you from? He asked when the music softened. From a house whose windows look into a garden, said Cinderella, and from a life where they call me when something impossible needs doing. Is that close to the palace? Closer than you think, she replied, but not on the map. Meanwhile, the hall was its own geography. The stepmother and sisters were present, performing as if on a stage of local ambitions. The sisters looked at the stranger, as one looks at luck that arrived uninvited and to the wrong address. The stepmother was calm. She could count. Beautiful stranger? Yes. Prince enchanted, possibly. But what about tomorrow morning? No one cancels tomorrow morning, she thought. And that was her practical wisdom. Cinderella took a glass of water. Yes, water. Dancing sober is a rare form of radicalism, and suddenly heard the faint sound of a clock, the first cautious stroke of time across the air. She knew not much time left, so she decided to taste a luxury she rarely allowed herself, asking directly. Tell me, she said to the prince, if tomorrow you find out I'm not who you think I am, will you be disappointed? Disappointment, he said quickly, is when the world fails to match the story told about it. I prefer rewriting the story. Agreed, said Cinderella. Then let me leave in such a way that you'll want to look for me. That's not difficult, he smiled. I already want to. Then came the second strike, and the third. Time stopped being polite. Cinderella understood. It was time. She bowed, the kind of bow people give when they still have something to protect, not too low, but sincere, and almost weightlessly she ran toward the exit. Chapter 6, where a shoe becomes evidence. The story of the slipper is better documented than most parliamentary debates. As she slipped down the stairs, Cinderella felt her right shoe loosen slightly. She stopped to fix it and decided to leave it. It was both caution. The next step was stone, not marble, and strategy. Let them try to find me by this thing that fits only one person perfectly, not in the size chart sense, but in stride, character, and tone of voice. She darted into the courtyard, and the world began its countdown of glorious disarray. The horses remembered their mousehood and panicked at their own present. The coachman recalled his ratty childhood. The pumpkin sighed with relief and reverted to itself. Cinderella made it, reached her garden like someone who excels at short distances when life demands a marathon. The door closed softly. The gown turned back into fabric awaiting future embroidery. Memory, not matter. The fairy appeared the way the best teachers do, just before the lesson cools. "Well done," she said. "You dance like a woman unafraid to be herself in someone else's walls." "I forgot the shoe," Cinderella panted. "That's not a loss. It's a method," said the fairy. "Now the prince has a cause and effect connection and an excuse for a journey. It's good for men to walk sometimes. It's just, I'm not sure I want to be found right away. I'd rather be heard than found." "Nothing prevents both," said the fairy. "You have a voice, he has ears." The rest is technique. Chapter 7, in which the prince walks among the people, and the people keep their dignity. By morning, the palace had turned into an expedition headquarters. The king said, "Now it's getting serious." The queen corrected, "Let's make it kind." And the prince added, "Let's make it honest." Royal shoemakers debated the width of the instep. Heralds rehearsed the phrase, "the slipper that will fit." And thus the journey began. To be fair, the prince was no fool. He knew that measuring love by footwear was a debatable choice, but legends prefer simple instruments. So he added a rule of his own: look not only at the foot, but into the eyes. The slipper was a pretext for conversation. Day after day, the carriage rolled through villages and towns. In one house, a distant aunt tried the shoe and announced she had stretched her toes for power. It looked exactly as that sounded. In another, a young woman laughed at her reflection and said, "Someone else's shoes don't suit me." And the prince admired her sense of proportion, though he knew she wasn't the one he sought. Sometimes he left the slipper on the table and simply listened to women, stories of how far the shadow of others' expectations could reach, of how narrow certain doors were, and how to pass through them sideways, with head held high. When the procession reached the house where the stepmother, the sisters, and Cinderella lived, the sky had the color of a restrained promise. The stepmother met the visit in full diplomatic readiness, like a person who always has both tea and gossip on hand. "We are honored to receive you, duh," she said, as if she had organized the entire affair. "I have 2 worthy daughters. They are the flowers of our district." The daughters came forward, indeed flowers. The first was a rose of the latest fashionable variety, with thorns. The second, a peony proving her modesty by her dress rather than her behavior. The slipper fit neither. The first sister forced it on, looking like a tantrum in a box. The second sighed so heavily she seemed to scold her own height. The prince didn't laugh. He saw not a comic scene, but 2 girls who had never been told the difference between fits you and fits the standard. "No one else?" he asked politely. "No one." "Worthy," said the stepmother, pronouncing worthy as though it meant well-combed. "No one is a bold word," said the prince. "Words demand responsibility." And just then Cinderella stepped out from the kitchen. not suddenly majestic, but naturally herself. A clean dress, hair neatly tied, a little flour on her hands. Her pies had a better reputation than her patience. She curtsied. The prince looked and understood, not with his mind, but with that inner ear where true melodies land. "May I?" she asked the stepmother. "And the world?" "You may," said the prince. The stepmother stayed silent, professional caution. The slipper slid onto her foot as memory does, quietly and precisely. But that was only confirmation. The real thing happened in the pause that followed. They met eyes, and in both of them flickered recognition. Not "here she is" and "here he is," but yesterday's music. Again. "Your Highness," said the stepmother, smiling the way people do when they've just acquired an opinion, "it seems fate favors my house." "Fate favors those who can hold a pause," said the prince, "and the pause wasn't yours." The sisters looked at Cinderella, then at the prince, and for the first time felt a faint shame, not for themselves, but for the years spent in rooms whose mirrors reflected only one kind of beauty. Chapter 8. Short as a breath. Weddings in stories like this usually serve as a screen behind which authors hide the words "happily ever after." But the prince had other plans. "I'd like some time," he told Cinderella as they walked in the garden, "not because I doubt, but because I've too often seen celebration devour the joy itself. I want to know your real home, not its festive doorway." "My home is a kitchen table in a garden," she said. "The table teaches sharing. The garden teaches waiting. Neither will earn you a crown, but both keep you breathing." "I care more about breathing," he said. "Crowns sometimes muffle the heart, and breathing, that's the music that plays by itself." They agreed not to turn the wedding into a project budget. Instead, they began to practice that ancient and demanding art. Friendship. Chapter 9, in which the stepmother and the sisters receive an unusual lesson. The stepmother had no time for boredom. She disliked being wrong and preferred being busy. But the rhythm of the house changed. Cinderella was no longer invisible. She no longer rose before everyone or went to bed last. The sisters grumbled lazily, then stopped. The air itself seemed easier to breathe. Turns out one can lift one's own cup, and even one's own thoughts. One evening, Cinderella said quietly to her stepmother, "You're a strong woman, but you've always chosen the short road. It seems profitable because you can see its end. Yet short roads dry out the heart, like wind dries laundry. I'm not angry. I'm just saying it won't be that way anymore." The stepmother wanted to reply sharply, but couldn't. It wasn't an argument. It was a renaming of a street. That night she sat by the window for a long time, and for the first time in years, wondered if strength might also mean living beside someone else's freedom. The sisters, surprisingly, discovered that the world was far more interesting than it had looked. One learned embroidery, not the kind where every rose is proof of patience, but the kind where stitches become sentences. The other began reading, not to quote, but to understand. Gradually, both acquired faces instead of masks, and that was beautiful. Chapter 10. Somewhat philosophical. Forgive me, but it must be so. Sometimes, when the prince visited without his retinue, he and Cinderella would sit in the garden and talk. Conversations about simple things inevitably turned into conversations about complicated ones. "What is happiness?" he asked once. "And please don't say a ball. I've checked. Balls end at midnight." "Happiness," said Cinderella, "is when you wake up in the morning and have a task that's within your power, and still have time to admire a branch. That's modest." "That's revolutionary," she replied. Most people live from others' tasks to others' expectations. Happiness is planning at least one joy of your own. And love? Love is an agreement to be surprised together. If it's more interesting in pairs than alone, that's already something. And if it's harder, then check the first point. Are you pretending to be people you aren't? He smiled. You could be let into the palace, you know. It lacks people who see long perspectives. I shouldn't be let in without disclaimers, she said. I'm allergic to empty ceremonies. Fair enough, he laughed. Then we'll make sure every ceremony has meaning. And if there's no meaning, we'll keep it short. They laughed, both knowing that laughter isn't the absence of seriousness. It's its best filter. Chapter 11, where the fairy also has her own life. Meanwhile, the fairy lived as those do whose names aren't written on facades, but without whom facades stand crooked. From time to time she visited Cinderella, bringing news and quiet advice. Remember, she said, miracles are also work. Overuse them, and they start breaking in your hands. Use magic like seasoning, not instead of the soup, but for its flavor. I try, said Cinderella, though sometimes I want to snap my fingers and rearrange other people's thoughts onto proper shelves. You can't, the fairy shook her head gently. Everyone has their own order. You can only offer light. The fairy told her stories. In one neighboring duchy, a girl had learned to read the stars and was now rewriting navigational maps. Elsewhere, a brave seamstress had invented a cut that allowed women to move freely and still feel elegant. The world was changing quietly while kings discussed coins. Chapter 12, in which everything is nearly decided, but without a neat ending. Of course, the wedding happened eventually, as small as possible, considering it involved an heir. There were flowers, the garden took care of that, music, not too loud, and food, simple and good. Cinderella whispered to the royal cook that extravagance doesn't decorate a feast, but parsley broth is pure poetry. Guests ate, danced, and marveled at how much joy could fit into such an unpretentious evening. The queen, a wise woman, came up to Cinderella and said, "You look like someone who knows how to make silence. That's a rare gift. The palace will breathe easier with you." "Silence isn't emptiness," said Cinderella. "It's the place where people finally hear themselves." After that, they often stop shouting. The king put his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Look, my boy. This is one of those times when our luck equals yours." The prince nodded. He truly was lucky. Chapter 13, about a kingdom where windows begin to open. Soon after the wedding, small reforms began, the kind that change life more tangibly than grand decrees. Pointless meetings at the palace were abolished. Servants were allowed to say no to requests that contradicted common sense. In the kitchen, people began listening to laundresses and pastry chefs. The former had a perfect sense of cleanliness, the latter of proportion. On Cinderella's initiative, the capital opened the window, a place where any woman could come and tell her story without fear of hearing the words, "Your fault." It turned out that when people are given space and time, they often find their own solutions. Sometimes all it takes is to adjust the fit of the shoe, not the foot. The prince focused on musicians. He introduced open rehearsal evenings. An odd idea at first, but when listeners saw how labor turns into music, they began to respect both. Counts and dukes grumbled at first. They were used to respecting only results. But slowly their faces grew a bit more alive, as if someone had opened a window. Chapter 14, where every fairy tale has its light and its shadow. Naturally, not everyone was pleased. Some whispered that a girl from the fireplace should not be teaching the court manners of breathing. Rumors rose, eyebrows followed, but Cinderella had a solid habit: to speak clearly. She didn't argue with everyone or duel with words for applause. She made decisions and explained them. Sometimes she was wrong, and she said so openly. That disarms better than any sword. One autumn day, when the air already smelled of apples and rain, the stepmother came to see her, not proudly, not pleading, just came. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, sitting down cautiously, as one who still fears defeat. "I'm not sure I deserve it, but I want to understand how you manage not to be afraid anymore." "I am afraid," said Cinderella, smiling. "I've just learned to admit it out loud. That way fear loses its position as a boss and stays only as a consultant." The stepmother was silent for a long time, then said, "I'd like to learn that. If it's not too late, say so honestly." "It's not too late," said Cinderella. "That's what windows are for. Let's sit by mine. We'll start with the basics. What can you do, truly?" "I can count." "Perfect. You'll help us manage the window's budget. Money behaves better when treated with fairness and arithmetic. And the stepmother—" Yes, that same sharp iron lady Dalton smiled for the first time, as if she'd finally unbuckled a heavy clasp from her thoughts. Chapter 15, which is really an interlude about shoes. The legend speaks of crystal, our version, tempered glass. Since then, the palace kept a shoemaking workshop. There they learned that the ideal last isn't a compliment to a dainty ankle. It's respect for the path a person must walk. The workshop became a place of pilgrimage. Women brought their stories along with their souls. One laughed, admitting she'd worn a size too small all her life to seem delicate, and now for the first time could breathe not just with her chest, but with her feet. Another, an elderly lady, brought her granddaughter and said, "Make her shoes that'll take her to her dream, not to other people's applause." The cobblers aged gracefully. They had much to remember. Chapter 16, where the prince calls things by their proper names. In those years, the prince, still a prince, for the king was in no hurry to retire, thankfully, once stepped out before the people without his retinue and delivered a short, plain speech. "For too long, he said, we have measured strength by volume. Let us start measuring it by precision. We shall do less, but do it better. And if anyone says kindness is weakness, ask them to walk barefoot on stone. Pain quickly explains why soft souls matter." People smiled. The king did too. He saw that his son had become a man who wasn't afraid to look ridiculous for the sake of meaning. A priceless achievement. Chapter 17, slightly nocturnal. One night, Cinderella went out into the garden. That same garden, with its apple trees, its bench, and its habit of listening. The moon looked as though she'd taken proper dance lessons. Cinderella sat and thought gratefully of the fairy, who, of course, understood that the art of helping lies in knowing when to appear. "Thinking of me?" came a familiar voice, the voice of a smooth page in a beloved book. "Always, when I hear how quietly the world changes," she said. The fairy smiled. In her hand she carried gloves, not for a ball, for gardening. "Need a hand?" "Always," said Cinderella easily, "but not magic, just hands. Today we're weeding." They worked side by side. Royal weeds are no different from ordinary ones, and they spoke the way people do when trust has settled between them, about losses that teach and discoveries that don't shout. "You know," said the fairy. "I've wondered, do we give fairy tales too much? People wait, and they don't act. But you act." "Because I know the price of magic," said Cinderella. "Magic isn't instead of, it's so you can see how." Chapter 18, where a small storm and a great calm occur. Of course there was a storm. Otherwise the story would stay a postcard. The king fell ill. The palace buzzed like a hive struck by a shawl of questions. They summoned the best doctors from the capital, the universities, and those villages where healing is done, as if conversing with the illness itself. The king recovered slowly, but he did recover, not through miracle, but through the presence of people who knew how simply to be there. Sometimes the best medicine is presence without demands. Cinderella held herself steady, as one holds a fragile cup. She organized care, assigned duties, replaced the curtains in the royal room with lighter ones, and brought a faint scent of time. The prince watched her and understood that to love isn't only about sighs and fireworks. It's about saying, "Let's make a schedule." When the king got better, he said, "I've thought long about who truly is queen in this palace. I believe I've found out." Cinderella bowed. "Your Majesty, the important thing is, in this palace the king now breathes in time with the people. And that," said the king, "is your music." Chapter 19, with a gentle afterword about the sisters. The sisters settled into the world surprisingly well. The one who had studied text embroidery opened a workshop called Stories on Fabric. Women came to her with their tales, and each left wearing a pattern that was pleasant to look at, and even more pleasant to pass on. The other sister, the reader, began collecting books for children who had spoons at home, but no stories. Sometimes they visited the palace for tea. They could still be capricious. That was their human right. But now their whims were no longer their profession. As for the stepmother, she worked at the window, carefully, precisely. Without unnecessary words, she counted numbers but saved people. They said she rarely smiled. That wasn't true. She smiled when no one was looking, and that was enough. Chapter 20, in which there is no end at all. We're used to fairy tales finishing with, "They lived happily ever after," as if happiness were a stable currency. In truth, happiness is more like a subscription. It must be renewed with attention, humor, and 2 pinches of common sense. Sometimes Cinderella would take out that slipper, not to wear, but to remember. She'd stand by that same window and think of the girl who was once allowed to be herself at someone else's celebration, and of the woman who later learned to create her own. The prince still played music. Matters of state sometimes passed by. He'd put down his lute, deal with the important, and return to find the melody waiting exactly where he'd left it. That happens when you don't betray what's essential for what's urgent. The fairy appeared less and less, which is a good sign. It meant that magic had settled in the house, not as spectacle but as a habit of paying attention. Once she sent a short note. "If it fits, call me." It smelled faintly of mint and thyme, a little credit of optimism toward the future. When girls were born in the kingdom, they were told not only about crystal. They were told, there are shoes and there is a road. Choose by foot, but walk by heart. And boys were taught that to seek by a slipper was a metaphor. You're not searching for footwear. You're searching for a person. And first of all, for yourself. Balls were still held, of course. People loved music. But now they came in comfortable shoes and with comfortable thoughts. If you asked what all this could be called in one word, I'd say, growing up. Growing up isn't when you're recognized. It's when you allow yourself to be who you are. The tale of Cinderella is precisely that, about a girl who once stepped out of the hearth not only with a pie, but with a plan, about a slipper that fit, not because the foot was tiny, but because the life was true to size, about a kingdom where the windows are open and people are no longer afraid to breathe. And if it seems there's too much common sense here for a fairy tale, don't worry. Common sense is magic too, just the adult version. Epilogue, not required, but pleasant. Late at night, when rain writes its own letters against the window, Cinderella sometimes sits by the fire. The flames crackle like an old friend. She takes the slipper out of its box, light, transparent, cool to the touch. She doesn't wear it. She holds it. It reminds her, once you chose to leave in time, so you could return for good and choice. That's the most honest kind of magic. The fire listens. The garden nods. The house smiles with its shutters. Somewhere, a little girl takes her first steps in new boots. Somewhere, a boy finally understands that being a prince means learning to listen and to take responsibility. Somewhere, the fairy takes up needle and thread, just in case. Stories go on. Each has its own shape, its own size, its own path. And if at midnight you hear a faint chime, don't be startled. It doesn't mean magic has ended. It means the shift has changed. The fairy tale has finished its watch, and life has taken over. And honestly, life is no worse. We place the period here, not as an ending, but as a breath before the next step.